On May 23, 1978, the supersonic airliner Tu-144D was performing a test flight before being handed over to Aeroflot for passenger operations. There were 8 test pilots aboard the aircraft. Since November 1, 1977, Tu-144 supersonic airliners had been operating passenger flights on the Moscow-Almaty route, a distance of 3,260 kilometers. However, the Tu-144S model used for these flights could only accommodate 80 passengers. This limitation was due to the relatively inefficient Nk-144A engines, which, with a commercial payload of 7 tons, provided the Tu-144S with a practical range of 3,600 kilometers. With a payload of 15 tons, the range decreased to 3,080 kilometers. For flights over 4,500 kilometers, new, more fuel-efficient engines were required. Work on this began back in 1964, eventually resulting in the development of the RD-36-51 engine. On June 4, 1969, the Military-Industrial Commission of the USSR Council of Ministers approved the creation of a Tu-144 aircraft equipped with these engines, which was designated as the Tu-144D. According to the resolution, the aircraft, with a takeoff weight of 150 tons and 150 passengers on board, was expected to have a range of 4,500 kilometers. With a takeoff weight of 180 tons, the range was to increase to 6,500 kilometers, comparable to the distance from Moscow to Vladivostok. On April 18, 1978, the Voronezh Aircraft Factory produced the first serial Tu-144D, equipped with upgraded RD-36-51 engines. The aircraft performed its maiden flight on April 27, after which it was transferred to the Flight Research Institute, now Zhukovsky. There, it completed 3 acceptance flights and 1 handover flight. On May 23, the airliner had already completed 5 flights with a total duration of 9 hours and 2 minutes. That day, the aircraft was scheduled to perform a second acceptance flight. This flight required reaching a supersonic speed of Mach 2 and then reducing speed to conduct a test of the Auxiliary Power Unit (APU) at an altitude of 3,000 m. The crew conducted standard pre-flight checks and took off from Ramenskoye Airfield at 17:30. The supersonic phase of the flight went smoothly, and the crew began testing the APU. To do so, the aircraft was leveled at an altitude of 3,000 m and slowed to 480 km per hour. At this point, a discrepancy of about 4.7 tons was observed between the fuel consumption and the readings of the fuel gauges. This indicated a difference between the initial fuel volume and the amount consumed by the engines, possibly pointing to a fuel leak. However, the flight engineers did not consider these readings significant. At 18:45, the crew initiated the APU startup. The pilots increased the speed to 500 km per hour, but shortly thereafter, the fire alarm activated, and the voice alert system announced, "Check for fire." The flight engineer reported a fire in the number 3 engine nacelle, deactivated the engine, and engaged the second and third fire suppression systems. The co-pilot then began a 180-degree turn to return to the airfield. According to test pilot Eduard Yelin, the commander of the aircraft, the discrepancy in fuel readings was noticed even during the initial climb after takeoff. However, the flight engineers and the lead engineer from the manufacturing plant neither reported this to the pilots nor investigated further. Instead, they simply adjusted the fuel readings to reflect a lower remaining amount. After the first APU startup failed, Yelin ordered co-pilot Popov to return to the airfield. However, during the turn, a second attempt to start the APU was made, which proved to be fatal. After completing the turn, the flight engineer reported another fire alarm, this time in the fourth engine. Fire suppression systems for that engine were activated as well. As a result, the aircraft was now flying on engines located only on the left wing. The commander maintained a heading towards the outer marker, DPRM, of the airfield. The pilots contacted Ramenskoye airfield controllers, reporting the fire and that the aircraft was flying on 2 engines. They requested a direct approach for landing and that firefighting equipment be prepared. Initially, besides the fire alarms, there were no obvious signs of a fire. The crew suspected system malfunctions. However, witnesses on the ground observed a large trail of flames behind the aircraft. Soon, the crew realized the fire was real as black smoke began entering the cockpit through the air conditioning system. The pipelines of the system, located in the right wing where the fire originated, were severely damaged. Popov suggested performing an emergency landing in a field, but Yelin initially objected, believing the aircraft could still reach the airfield. To improve visibility, the pilots lowered the nose cone by 17 degrees. However, the smoke intensified, disorienting Yelin. Consequently, Popov took over sole control of the aircraft. The fire soon engulfed another engine, forcing the flight engineer to shut it down. The aircraft was now flying on a single engine. Shortly after, the flight engineer reported a generator failure, with the aircraft running solely on battery power. Eduard Yelin later recalled, "I was overwhelmed with anger when I realized the aircraft was on fire and couldn't be saved. This anger grew as I thought about losing our first serial Tu-144, which was meant to begin passenger flights to Khabarovsk. I didn't think about myself for a second, only feared suffocating from the cursed smoke. To breathe, I had to strain my body as if enduring high G-forces, and exhale loudly to make it easier. I didn't let go of the control column for a second." The Tu-144 was flying at 1,500 m but was rapidly losing altitude. Although the crew had parachutes, they decided against jumping due to the low altitude and the risk of falling into the flames. Realizing they couldn't reach the airfield, the crew decided to perform an emergency landing on a chosen site. Flying at a heading of 240 degrees and a speed of 400 km per hour, the burning Tu-144 leveled off 5 meters above the ground before touching down on a marshy clearing. The aircraft skidded for about a kilometer, 500 meters of which were on its belly, before coming to a stop. The pilots kept the nose raised until the nose cone struck the ground. After the stop, pilots Popov, Yelin, and navigator Vyazhigin exited the cockpit through the windows. Engineers Kulesh, Isaev, and Stolpovsky escaped through the forward entrance door. However, flight engineers Venediktov and Nikolaev were killed, trapped by their seats that dislodged upon impact. The crash occurred at 1856 in the Voskresensky district of Moscow Oblast, near Yegoryevsk. The crash occurred despite Tu-144 aircraft already being in passenger service. To investigate the technical causes of the disaster in detail, the Tupolev Design Bureau, OKB Tupolev, created special test benches that simulated the conditions encountered during the flight. Analysis of the wreckage and flight recorder data quickly revealed that the immediate cause of the fire was the ignition of fuel vapors during the Auxiliary Power Unit (APU) startup. However, it was necessary to determine how fuel had entered the APU area. On the test benches, the fuel systems of the aircraft and engines were thoroughly tested, including their operation under different scenarios. These tests revealed a previously unknown issue: fatigue fractures in the fuel lines caused by self-induced vibrations from the internal fuel flow. While theoretical models and literature predicted a fuel pulsation frequency of around 100 Hz, in the Tu-144 system, this frequency reached 1,500 Hz. This resulted in critical stresses that significantly reduced the durability of the pipelines. Additionally, the method of cleaning fuel lines using pulsations of a two-phase flow further reduced their lifespan by more than half. The high fuel pressure in the system also contributed to significant hydraulic shocks, exacerbating the problem. 3 months after the disaster, a commission of over 100 experts concluded the investigation. It was determined that a fuel leak in the engine nacelle began around 1818, with a flow rate of approximately 220 kilograms per minute. This leak persisted until the end of the flight, resulting in a total fuel loss of about 8 tons. The fuel leaked due to a loss of sealing in the pipeline connections, flowing onto the bottom of the engine nacelle and into the space between the rear sections of the air intake. The ignition of the APU triggered the fire, which spread to adjacent compartments, including the APU itself. The APU's exhaust pipe became an additional channel for fire propagation. Attempts to restart the APU only worsened the situation, causing surges that ignited residual fuel. The flight engineers noticed that more fuel had leaked from the tanks than had been consumed by the engines. However, due to prior experiences of discrepancies in fuel gauge readings during test flights and the replacement of the number 3 engine before this flight, which reduced fuel consumption, the crew dismissed the anomaly as a calibration error. Over 30 minutes passed during which the fuel continued leaking, while other systems appeared to function normally, further convincing the engineers that the readings were inaccurate. The disaster highlighted the robust design of the Tu-144. Even engulfed in flames, the aircraft remained fully controllable. Despite a significant impact with the ground and a powerful post-crash fire, the aircraft did not explode, allowing part of the crew to survive. All identified deficiencies in the fuel system were rectified in subsequent RD-36-51A engines. OKB Tupolev introduced new durability standards for fuel pipelines, accounting for increased hydraulic shocks and fatigue stresses. Improved cleaning methods were adopted, and issues with end valve closures were resolved. Despite these improvements, the crash was a major factor in the cessation of passenger flights on the Tu-144.